Welcome to AP European History with Mr. Volby. Today we'll be discussing sections 3 and 4 of Chapter 12 from McKay et al., 7th edition, The Crisis of the Later Middle Ages. These two sections deal with the Hundred Years' War and the divide in the church. Starting with the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, we find that the ultimate cause is a dispute over land and succession to the throne between England and France. They're interconnected at this point in history. England even lays claim to various parts of what would now be modern-day France. And it starts as a result of a dispute of succession over the throne. The English lay claim to the throne of France because Queen Isabella was the last remaining heir to the throne of Philip the Fair. Charles IV had died without children. Queen Isabella and her lover had killed her husband, King Edward II, and proclaimed her son, King Edward III, as the ruler of England. And therefore, when Charles died, also the ruler of France. Edward III claimed Aquitaine as an ancient inheritance in the Treaty of Paris in 1259, and the French rejected his claims based on Salic law, which forbade females and those descended from females in their line to succeed in office. It didn't really get sorted out earlier because there was a tremendous amount of infighting in France. Also, the wool trade was something that was very significant to many people in northern France. It's referred to in your text as Flanders, a port city, and in England. And this was a primary economic consideration of the day. Wealthy merchants who relied on England sided with England, even though they lived in France, because they feared that they were disrupting the commerce. Both kings used various forms of propaganda to talk about how disgusting and maltreated they had been by the other side. And this worked. It created a lot of hostility during the war as it went on, back and forth. One of the key components of the Hundred Years' War is the idea of chivalry. And chivalry was the code of knights, code of conduct that was used that demanded an etiquette to battle. And this was an opportunity to show bravery and courtesy and generosity to social equals. However, one thing we find is that throughout the Hundred Years' War, many people who signed on to fight, because it went on for so long, were far more interested in pillaging and finding wealth, which was most often squandered almost immediately. And the other part of the idea of chivalry that died was the fact that men did not care about the way that they won. Okay? Longbows and cannons were new technology that were used. Longbows were not very accurate, but they could be shot several times in a minute, high up into the air and rain down on opposing forces from quite a distance. And this had a profound effect. More early battles were fought in France. More overall battles were fought in France, and this will be one of the outcomes that we have to deal with. The most notable battle of the Hundred Years' War is the Battle of Crécy in northern France in 1346. The longbow and the cannon were first used here by the English. They were not considered part of that code of chivalry which we talked about, that code of conduct, but they helped England win early battles and confuse the French. The English were winning all the way up through the 1430s. And that is when we get to the infamous Joan of Arc. She was a French peasant girl. She was from what you would consider a more well-to-do peasant family. And she believed that she had started hearing voices as a teen. She found her way to the French monarch, Charles VII, and persuaded him to allow her to accompany the army to Orleans. And up to this point, the English had been far more successful in gaining territory, as your text will show in a succession of maps on page 391. But at the Battle of Orleans, the English withdrew, and Charles was crowned king, which led to a great mystique about Joan. However, this was relatively short-lived, as she was later captured and condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake by the English, with consequentially no French intervention. They didn't stand up for her, they didn't come to get her. The significance of Joan of Arc and the significance of the Battle of Orleans was that it was a major turning point in morale in the war, which eventually allowed the French to overthrow and drive the English off of mainland Europe. Costs and consequences of the war, one of the things that we always have to look at when we're looking at wars and their impact. Enormous loss of life, adding on to the population decline from the plague. In France specifically, lots of farmland was ruined and the economy was stifled. This was not so much the case in England. However, England suffered a heavy economic burden. There was a ton of social upheaval as knights who usually acted as law enforcement were off to war. And another consequence that was positive for the people was that the English Parliament was actually strengthened. This is just the opposite in France if you do your reading. And the reason that the English Parliament was strengthened is because the king needed to raise taxes. And in order to raise taxes and get the people to agree to these taxes without rising up, he needed to provide for more opportunities for people to have a say in the government. Overall, there was a rise in nationalism. This is the case even in France, where most French people consider themselves not French necessarily, but to be from the area that they came. There was, however, a rise here in nationalism. The French expelled the English from mainland Europe, and this would start to move us toward the European map that we're much more familiar with today. Section 4 of chapter 12 deals with the decline of the church's prestige, and we start that out with the Babylonian captivity. And this is used in conjunction with the idea of the Hebrews who were held captive by the Mesopotamians in Babylon for 70 plus years. And the Babylonian captivity is when Philip the Fair of France pressured Pope Clement V to settle in Avignon in France, as opposed to in Rome, where the papacy had been. And this was all an effort to control the church. At this time, the church was still seen as far more powerful than government, and government and church worked together. This, however, disconnected the papacy from Rome and the spiritual matters of the church. Many of the popes and the cardinals who lived there lived more extravagant lives. They did not pay a lot of attention to the everyday needs of the people, and this created some chaos. In 1377, Gregory XI finally moved the papacy back to Rome, where he died shortly after and was succeeded by Urban VI. Urban had very good intentions. He wanted to reform the church and get away from the bad publicity that had been given to the church by the extravagant ways of many of the church leaders. However, his strong hand pushed the cardinals away from Rome, and they elected the anti-pope, Clement VII, who was seated in Avignon once again. So now we have two popes. This idea of two popes created what is known historically as the Great Schism. And the Great Schism or divide in the church would last from the election of Clement VII in 1378 until 1417. It divided the powers of Europe primarily along strictly political lines, not so much along religious lines. And it also confused the common people. And this was a real stressful thing because faith was weakened. There was a lot of instability and excess still among the religious leaders. And it was a time following the plague when people really needed faith and only saw leaders of the church fighting over power. So this was a pretty confusing time for people when it came to the church. And this is all setting the foundation for the Reformation. The conciliar movement is in response to this idea of the Great Schism and who is the rightful pope. Conciliars were people who believed that the church reform should be brought about by the people. We have a few of them mentioned here. Marsilio of Padua. Much earlier, he wrote the Defensor Pacis, which theorized that the state, not the church, was a great unifying power in society. John Wycliffe was an English reformer. His followers were called the Lollards, and he believed that scripture, not the Pope, should be standard Christian practice. And then Jan Hus was a follower of Wycliffe, and he believed that the Bible was of higher authority than the Pope. What these three gentlemen had in common was something very different than what was practiced from the foundations of the church through medieval times, that the Pope was perhaps above the Bible, and what he said oversaw everything else. These three gentlemen believed that church reform came from the people and by the people, and that it was important for them to know and understand what it meant to be Christian. This was obviously something that was opposed by church leadership because it meant a decrease in their power, and it got all of these gentlemen either executed or excommunicated. Just as we think the conciliar movement is working in response to the general population's pressure, the Council of Pisa was summoned in 1409. This led to the election of a third pope and dismissed the Pope in Avignon and the Pope in Rome. However, both of them refused to step down, which meant for a very brief period of time, for about 5 years, there were actually 3 popes, providing for much more confusion for the people. Finally, the German Emperor Sigismund called the Great Council of Constance, and this was summoned in 1414 with 3 objectives: to end the schism, to reform the church, and to wipe out heresy. They elected a new pope, Martin V, and he proceeded to dissolve the council, which meant that out of the 3 objectives, really the only thing that happened is the schism was ended. Reform did not take place, and heresy was dealt with mildly. Later on, in 1450, the papacy would claim victory over the conciliar movement, showing their arrogance and belief that they had overcome this reform movement by the church. However, as we'll see as we move on through the next couple of chapters, both the schism and the conciliar movement laid crucial foundations for reform of the church. That concludes this brief lecture on sections 3 and 4 of chapter 12. Thank you.